In 1884, 14 European nations gathered in Berlin for 3 months to decide the fate of an entire continent. Not a single African was invited. In elegant rooms on Wilhelmstrasse, they established rules that allowed them to carve up a vast landmass into colonies. The result was some of the strangest borders in the world. Straight lines cutting through the Sahara Desert, narrow strips of land that make no sense, nations stitched together from hundreds of completely different ethnic groups. 140 years later, these borders remain the primary cause of conflict, civil war, and instability across Africa. In this video, we will explore 3 critical questions. First, what rules did the Berlin Conference establish that allowed European powers to partition Africa? Second, why are these borders so absurd that they cut across ethnic groups, force historical enemies to live together, and create bizarre national shapes? And third, how did decisions made in Berlin lead to the Congo catastrophe under King Leopold, the Nigerian Civil War, and the Rwanda Genocide? If you want to understand why Africa still struggles with conflict and poverty decades after independence, stay with me for the next 20 minutes.
Let us begin by looking at a modern map of Africa. In 2025, the continent has 54 independent nations. But if you look closely, you will notice something very strange. Most borders follow no natural logic. They do not follow rivers. They do not follow mountain ranges. And they certainly do not respect where ethnic groups actually live. Instead, you see perfect, straight lines cutting through the Sahara Desert. The border between Libya and Chad is a straight line stretching hundreds of kilometers through desert. Same with the border between Egypt and Sudan, between Algeria and Mali. These lines look like someone used a ruler on a map without caring about the terrain or the people living there. And then you have even more bizarre shapes. Look at the Gambia. This is a small West African country shaped like a narrow finger pointing into Senegal. It stretches about 300 kilometers along the Gambia River, only 10 to 50 kilometers wide on each side. Basically, the Gambia cuts Senegal in half. If you want to travel from the capital Dakar in northern Senegal down to the Casamance region in the south, you must cross an international border twice or take an extremely long detour, or look at the Caprivi Strip in Namibia. This is a narrow panhandle stretching about 450 kilometers eastward from Namibia, only 30 to 100 kilometers wide. It looks like someone randomly drew a tail onto the country. But perhaps the strangest thing is not the shapes of countries, but how these borders divide people. Take the Somali people as an example. Somalis are one of the few groups in Africa that truly fit the European definition of a nation-state. They speak the same language, share the same culture, and are mostly Sunni Muslim. In theory, they should have one unified country. But instead, Somali people were divided into 5 different territories. British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland later merged to form modern Somalia. French Somaliland became Djibouti. The Ogaden region went to Ethiopia. And the Northern Frontier District went to Kenya. Somalia's flag has a 5-pointed star, symbolizing the desire to reunite all 5 territories. But that dream has never been realized and has led to devastating wars. Or, look at Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation. Nigeria contains over 250 different ethnic groups. The north is mostly Hausa and Fulani, predominantly Muslim, with feudal political traditions through an emirate system. The southwest is Yoruba, both Muslim and Christian, with constitutional monarchy traditions and high urbanization. The southeast is Igbo, predominantly Christian, with decentralized republican societies based on consensus rather than centralized authority. These 3 regions have very little in common. So why were they forced into one country? The answer to all these questions lies in an event that took place over 140 years ago, in the winter of 1884, in a city thousands of kilometers from Africa.
But before we talk about the Berlin Conference, we need to destroy a lie that European powers used to justify colonizing Africa. They called it the civilizing mission. They claimed Africa was a wilderness, with no civilization, no history, waiting for Europeans to bring order and progress. This was completely false. Before Europeans arrived, Africa was home to powerful empires, centers of learning, and sophisticated trade networks. Take the Mali Empire as an example. In the 14th century, Mali was one of the wealthiest empires in the world. The capital, Timbuktu, was not a synonym for remoteness, as Westerners often think. It was a world-class center of Islamic scholarship. The University of Sankore and hundreds of madrasas trained scholars who corresponded with the wider Islamic world. The Timbuktu manuscripts, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, covered subjects from astronomy and mathematics to law and theology. This is undeniable proof of a sophisticated civilization that existed for centuries before Europeans appeared. And then there was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, who made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. He carried so much gold that he caused inflation in Egypt and the Middle East. His wealth astonished all of Europe. In the south, we have Great Zimbabwe, a powerful state that existed from the 11th to 15th century. The massive stone ruins prove centralized political organization. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, and Arab coins, confirming that Great Zimbabwe was integrated into the global economy long before the Portuguese sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. The gold trade network, flowing through Swahili city-states like Kilwa and Sofala, connected the African interior to Asian markets, creating a monsoon marketplace that operated without European intermediaries. The important point here is that pre-colonial African sovereignty was not based on rigid border lines like Europe. Instead, it was based on control over people, trade routes, and allegiance networks. There were soft borders, or frontiers, zones of interaction, where authority diminished as you moved away from the center. This system allowed nomadic pastoralists and sedentary farmers to coexist. But the European model of hard borders was fundamentally incompatible with this African logic.
In the late 19th century, European powers were racing to claim territory in Africa. Before 1880, only about 10% of the African continent was under European control, mostly coastal areas. But by 1914, 90% had been colonized. What happened in those 30 years? The answer lies in the Berlin Conference, convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. From November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, delegates from 14 nations met at his official residence on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. The official purpose of the conference was to regulate free trade and navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers. But in reality, this was a diplomatic safety valve designed to prevent European rivalries from escalating into war in Europe itself. The major powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal, dominated the discussions. They were joined by smaller colonial powers like Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium, as well as nations with no colonial stake in Africa, but interested in trade or prestige, like Austria-Hungary, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Russia, Turkey, and the United States. Notably, the United States attended but did not ratify the final treaty and did not claim any colonies in Africa, but most important was who was not invited. Not a single African leader, diplomat, or representative was invited. The Sultan of Zanzibar, who controlled a significant portion of the East African coast, was excluded. The ancient Christian emperor of Ethiopia was ignored. This total exclusion underscored the conference's fundamental premise. Africa was an object of international law, a resource to be divided, not a collection of sovereign subjects. The fate of over 100 million people was decided by men who, with few exceptions, had never set foot on the continent. Now, this is the crucial point many people misunderstand. The Berlin Conference did not directly draw the final map of Africa at the conference table. Instead, it established the rules by which the partition would be recognized by other European powers. The outcome was the General Act of the Berlin Conference, a document that formalized the rules for partition. The most consequential provision was the principle of effective occupation, stated in Articles 34 and 35. Previously, a European power could claim rights to a coast or hinterland through paper claims, planting a flag, or declaring a sphere of influence. But the Berlin Act stipulated that for a claim to be internationally recognized, the colonial power had to demonstrate effective authority. This meant establishing a physical presence, administrative posts, military garrisons, and the capacity to protect trade and transit. What was the consequence of this principle? It triggered the violent acceleration of the scramble for Africa. To secure their claims before rivals could, European powers rushed military expeditions into the interior. Treaties were manufactured at gunpoint. African rulers, often unable to read the European languages of the documents they signed, usually marked with an X, were tricked into ceding sovereignty in exchange for vague promises of protection. The General Act essentially weaponized cartography. A line drawn on a map in Berlin or Paris became a mandate for a military column to march until it reached that line, subjugating everything in its path. This logic led to the creation of borders entirely divorced from the human geography of the regions they bisected.
No region illustrates the tragedy of the Berlin Conference more vividly than the Congo Basin. While other territories were claimed by nations, the Congo was recognized as the personal private property of one man, King Leopold the Second of Belgium. Leopold had spent years maneuvering for a colony. He famously stated he did not want to miss a slice of this magnificent African cake. He founded the Association Internationale du Congo, a front organization posing as a philanthropic and scientific society dedicated to ending the Arab slave trade and bringing civilization to Central Africa. Through a masterclass of diplomatic deception, Leopold convinced the great powers, particularly the United States and Germany, to recognize his claim to the vast Congo Basin. He argued that a free state open to free trade would be better than allowing Britain or France to monopolize the region. The Berlin Conference officially recognized the boundaries of the Congo Free State, an area 76 times the size of Belgium, encompassing the entire Congo River drainage basin. This border creation was a triumph of geometry over humanity, enclosing hundreds of distinct ethnic groups into a single unit designed solely for profit extraction. The economic foundation of the Congo Free State was wild rubber extraction, a commodity in high demand due to the invention of the pneumatic tire. To maximize profit, Leopold's administration instituted a system of forced labor enforced by the force public, a private army of African recruits led by European officers. The violence used to meet rubber quotas was systematic and psychopathic. Villages were assigned quotas. If they failed to meet them, the force public would burn the village, rape the women, and murder the men. To ensure soldiers were not wasting ammunition on hunting, they were required to present a severed hand for every bullet fired. This accounting of death led to the grotesque practice of soldiers cutting hands off living people, including children, to cover up missed shots or meet the tally demanded by their officers. The demographic impact of Leopold's rule was apocalyptic. While precise census data from the period does not exist, demographic analyses and contemporary estimates suggest horrific population collapse. Modern historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, the Congo population may have declined by approximately 50%, representing a loss of approximately 10 million lives due to murder, starvation, exhaustion, and disease exacerbated by the disruption of farming and social structures. George Washington Williams, an African-American minister who visited the Congo in 1890, was one of the first to use the term crimes against humanity to describe the regime. International outrage, spearheaded by reformers like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement, eventually forced the Belgian government to strip Leopold of his personal fiefdom in 1908, renaming it the Belgian Congo. However, the structural logic of the state remained extractive. Belgian colonial philosophy was characterized by a paternalism, often summarized as no elites, no problems. The administration deliberately stifled the development of a Congolese intellectual or political class. Education was almost exclusively in the hands of Catholic missionaries and was limited to primary schooling and vocational training. The goal was to produce disciplined workers and obedient subjects, not citizens capable of governance. The scale of this educational suppression is staggering. On the eve of independence in 1960, in a country of approximately 14 million people, there were only 16 to 30 Congolese nationals holding a university degree. There were virtually no Congolese in the senior ranks of the civil service or the officer corps of the army. This lack of preparation was not an accident. It was policy. When independence arrived abruptly in 1960, the state structure was a hollow shell. The mutiny of the force public within days of independence, the secession of the mineral-rich Katanga province, and the assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba were the direct results of a border drawn for a king and a state built to fail. The chaos of 1960 set the trajectory for decades of dictatorship under Mobutu Sese Seko and the subsequent African World Wars from 1996 to 2003 that claimed millions more lives. Today, the eastern provinces of Congo remain rich in coltan, a mineral critical for smartphones, and cobalt, essential for electric vehicles. But because state infrastructure does not extend effectively from Kinshasa over 1,500 kilometers through dense forest, these regions operate as autonomous zones. Militias, often backed by Rwanda and Uganda, exploit these resources to finance their wars. The struggle for control over the mines that supply the world's smartphones and electric cars has kept the region in perpetual conflict.
Now let us examine some specific examples of cartographic absurdity, borders that defy all geographic, ethnic, and economic logic. Let us start with the Caprivi Strip in Namibia. This is one of the most peculiar shapes on the African map. It appears as a narrow panhandle, approximately 450 kilometers long and 30 to 100 kilometers wide, jutting eastward from the main territory of Namibia. What is its origin? The strip owes its existence to the Heligoland Zanzibar Treaty of 1890, a diplomatic swap between Germany and Britain. Germany, seeking to connect its colony in Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, with its territory in German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, negotiated for access to the Zambezi River. German Chancellor Leo von Caprivi believed that the Zambezi would provide a navigable highway to the Indian Ocean, bypassing British-controlled territories. But here is the problem. The German negotiators made a profound geographical error. They ignored the existence of Victoria Falls, or Mosi Oatunya as local people call it. Located just downstream from the Strip's terminus, this massive waterfall, one of the largest in the world, renders the river completely unnavigable for trade vessels. The corridor to the east was a dead end. So what happened? Germany had traded the island of Zanzibar, an extremely valuable strategic territory, for a strip of land leading to nowhere. But the border remained. The strip arbitrarily separated the Lozi people of Barat's land in modern western Zambia from their kin in Namibia and Botswana. For nearly a century, the region was neglected, serving only as a strategic buffer zone for South African military operations during the apartheid era. This isolation and the disruption of the Lozi kingdom fostered a deep sense of separateness, culminating in the Caprivi secessionist conflict in the late 1990s, a modern war fought over a border drawn by a chancellor who did not know about a waterfall. Now let us turn to Nigeria. Nigeria, the continent's most populous nation, is often cited as the ultimate colonial construct. Its existence as a single entity dates to 1914, orchestrated by British Governor-General Sir Frederick Lugard in what is called the amalgamation. The logic of the amalgamation was purely British economic convenience. The Northern Protectorate, landlocked and dependent on a feudal emirate system, was running a budget deficit. The Southern Protectorate, rich in palm oil and coastal trade, had a budget surplus. Lugard amalgamated the two so that the South could subsidize the North, reducing the burden on the British Treasury. This forced marriage brought together over 250 distinct ethnic groups with vastly different political traditions and religious orientations. The North, dominated by Hausa Fulani people, is predominantly Muslim, governed through a centralized, hierarchical emirate system which the British preserved through indirect rule. The Southwest, home to the Yoruba people, is a mix of Christians and Muslims with constitutional monarchy, traditions, and significant urbanization. The Southeast, dominated by the Igbo people, is predominantly Christian or animist, organized in decentralized, republican, acephalous societies where authority was conferred by consensus and achievement rather than lineage. The British governed these regions as separate entities until the very end of the colonial period, preventing the emergence of a unified national identity. Educational policies further deepened the divide. Christian missionaries were encouraged in the South, but restricted in the North to avoid offending the emirs. The result was a massive cultural and educational gap. In southern Nigeria, heavy missionary activity led to high literacy rates, approximately 80 to 90% in areas like Lagos and Imo. In northern Nigeria, where missionary schools were restricted and education focused on Quranic schooling, literacy rates are only about 30 to 40% in states like Yobe and Borno. The national average is about 60%, but this figure masks profound inequality. The fragility of this union exploded shortly after independence. The 1966 coups, driven by ethnic suspicion, led to the secession of the Igbo-dominated Southeast as the Republic of Biafra. The resulting Nigerian Civil War, from 1967 to 70, was a catastrophe. The federal government, seeking to preserve the colonial borders, imposed a total blockade on Biafra.
The death toll is estimated to range from 500,000 to over 2 million people, the vast majority being civilians and children who died of starvation. Images of starving Biafran children shocked the world and led to the founding of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. But the borders remained unchanged. Today, the North-South divide remains the central fault line of Nigerian politics, influencing everything from resource allocation to the rotation of the presidency. The ongoing Boko Haram insurgency in the north is partly rooted in the educational and economic disparities created by colonial policy. The tragedy of the Great Lakes region is rooted in how colonial powers manipulated identity. Before Europeans arrived, the distinction between Hutu and Tutsi was largely a socio-economic class distinction. Tutsis were generally cattle owners and the ruling elite, while Hutus were farmers. However, the categories were fluid. A wealthy Hutu could become Tutsi, a process called kwihutura, and a poor Tutsi could become Hutu. Intermarriage was common, and both spoke the same language, Kinyarwanda, and shared the same culture. But Belgian colonizers and the Germans before them viewed African society through the lens of 19th century scientific racism. They applied the Hamitic hypothesis, positing that the Tutsis were a superior Caucasian race of invaders from the Nile Valley who were natural rulers over the indigenous Bantu Hutus. This racist theory had zero basis in reality. The Belgian administration codified this racist theory into law. In 1933, they introduced mandatory identity cards that classified every Rwandan as Hutu, 85%, Tutsi, 14%, or Twa, 1%. This administrative act froze fluid social identities into rigid racial castes. Fathers' identities determined the ethnicity of their children forever. For decades, the Belgians privileged the Tutsis, giving them exclusive access to education and administration, while subjecting the Hutus to forced labor. But in the late 1950s, as independence loomed, the Belgians cynically switched support to the Hutu majority to ensure their own influence in the post-colonial era. The resentment cultivated over decades of colonial favoritism exploded in the social revolution of 1959 and culminated in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. The very identity cards introduced by the colonial administration became death warrants. Militias set up roadblocks and demanded ID cards, killing anyone identified as Tutsi. In 100 days, from April to July, between 500,000 and 800,000 people were murdered, a direct legacy of the colonial ossification of identity. The critical point here is that the Rwanda genocide is often portrayed as ancient tribal hatred. But the reality is that colonial powers created ethnic division where previously a fluid class system existed. The tribalism blamed for African conflicts was often manufactured by colonial categorization, not pre-existing. Now, it is important to acknowledge that scholars disagree about the extent to which colonial legacy explains Africa's problems today. Let us consider three main perspectives. The first perspective comes from post-colonial scholars who emphasize colonial impact. Scholars like Walter Rodney, in his work How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, argue that colonial extraction systematically underdeveloped the continent. Mahmoud Mamdani, in Define and Rule, shows how colonial divide and rule policies institutionalized ethnic conflict. Arbitrary borders severed trade networks, forced incompatible groups together, and created weak states.
These scholars cite evidence such as the correlation between straight-line borders and conflict intensity. Resource extraction economies left no infrastructure for development. Educational suppression, like the case of Congo with only 30 graduates at independence, ensured state failure. Their argument is that modern African conflicts directly trace to Berlin Conference decisions. The borders were designed for extraction, not governance. Until these structural problems are addressed, the continent will continue to struggle. The second perspective comes from economic historians, who present a more nuanced view. Scholars like Jeffrey Herbst note that pre-colonial Africa also had conflicts and slavery. Paul Collier, in The Bottom Billion, argues that the resource curse affects governance regardless of colonial history. Daron Acemoglu and co-authors emphasize that the quality of institutions matters. Some colonies developed better institutions than others. They cite evidence like the Botswana success story. Botswana, a British protectorate, largely neglected because it was seen as a desert wasteland, avoided the worst of settler colonialism. Upon independence, when massive diamond reserves were discovered, the country's leadership, under Sir Seretse Khama, managed to utilize the resource rents for national development. Today, Botswana is an upper-middle-income country with a stable democracy. Post-independence factors also matter. Cold War interference, as in Congo and Angola, destabilized regions. Corrupt dictatorships, like Mobutu in Zaire, plundered nations. Failed economic policies hindered growth. Their argument is that colonial legacy is real and significant, but not the sole explanatory factor. Post-independence governance, the Cold War, and global economic structures are also major contributors. Africa has agency in shaping its future. The third perspective comes from African voices themselves, and they are very diverse. The Pan-Africanist tradition, led by figures like Kwame Nkrumah, argued for immediate political unification to overcome colonial fragmentation. Julius Nyerere advocated keeping borders to avoid chaos, but building African unity. Modern African intellectuals hold varying views. Some emphasize colonial reparations and acknowledgement. Others argue that Africa must move forward, take responsibility, stop the victimhood narrative. Young Africans increasingly reject the binary, acknowledge history, but focus on solutions. An example of this thinking can be summarized as follows. Yes, colonialism devastated us. Yes, borders are artificial. But we have been independent for 60 years. At what point do we take ownership of our future? Data on borders supports some of these concerns. Academic research shows that countries with more artificial borders, such as straight lines and ethnic fragmentation, have higher conflict rates. But correlation is not always causation. Governance quality matters enormously.
So when independence arrived in the 1960s, why did African leaders not redraw borders? Why did they keep the colonial lines? At the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, leaders faced an existential dilemma. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana argued for immediate political unification to prevent balkanization, the fragmentation into weak states. But the majority, led by figures like Julius Nyerere and Haile Selassie, argued that attempting to redraw borders would open a Pandora's box of endless warfare. Every nation would have claims on its neighbors, leading to total chaos. In the Cairo Declaration of 1964, the OAU adopted the legal principle of uti possidetis juris, a Latin phrase meaning, as you possess under law, pledging to respect the borders existing on their achievement of national independence. What was this trade-off? This decision effectively froze the colonial map in international law. While it likely prevented continent-wide interstate wars, it converted boundary disputes into internal civil wars. By legitimizing the colonial cage, the OAU ensured that ethnic grievances would be directed against the central state as secessionism, rather than neighboring states. The rigidity of uti possidetis held for decades, with Eritrea in 1993 and South Sudan in 2011 being the rare exceptions. The case of South Sudan serves as a grim validation of the dangers of forcing incompatible regions together. The British Southern policy from 1930 to 46 had administered the South as a separate entity, closing it off to Northern influence. But in a sudden reversal in 1947, Britain decided to unite the two ahead of independence. The South was merged with the North without its consent, leading to two civil wars, from 1955 to 72 and from 1983 to 2005, and eventually partition. But the split has not ended the violence. The new border remains contested, and the internal ethnic divisions within South Sudan, between Dinka and Nuer, mirror the broader colonial pattern of divide and rule.
Now let us talk about why all this matters to the world today, in 2025. The legacy of 1884 remains the primary driver of geopolitical risk in Africa. Take Western Sahara as an example. This represents the unfinished business of decolonization. When Spain withdrew in 1975, the territory was claimed by Morocco. The Polisario Front fights for independence. The conflict remains frozen with a separation wall called the Berm, dividing the territory, illustrating the continued friction between colonial legalities and indigenous rights. Ethiopia and Eritrea continue to struggle with their geography. Ethiopia, landlocked since Eritrea's independence in 1993, continues to struggle with port access. The war from 1998 to 2000 between the two nations was fought over the village of Badme, a dusty settlement with no economic value but immense symbolic value as a point on a colonial map. Tensions from 2024 to 25 regarding Ethiopia's desire for port access highlight how colonial treaties between Italy and Ethiopia continue to dictate modern security. Somalia represents a cruel irony. The one African people who fit the definition of a nation-state have been unable to maintain a state at all. Why? Colonial borders forced them into perpetual conflict with neighbors to reclaim their kin. The state collapsed in 1991 and has not recovered. In the DRC, the eastern provinces remain in perpetual conflict. Militias fight for control of coltan mines for smartphones and cobalt for electric cars. The state is too large to govern, borders too artificial. The African World Wars from 1996 to 2003 claimed over 5 million lives. But the colonial legacy is not just about political conflict, it is about economic structures. The map of colonial railways reveals a striking and consistent pattern. Lines run perpendicular to the coast, linking mines and plantations directly to ports. They rarely interconnect. In West Africa, the railways in British Ghana and French Ivory Coast ran parallel to each other, but never connected. The logic was simple. Get the timber, cocoa, and minerals out of the country and to Europe as fast as possible. The impact of this archipelago economy is that it was, and often still is, easier and cheaper to ship goods from an African capital to London or Paris than to a neighbouring African capital. This infrastructure dependency solidified the continent's role as an exporter of raw materials and an importer of finished goods, a structural flaw that modern initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area are struggling to correct. The lack of inter-regional connectivity remains a massive tax on African growth.
Let us talk about the numbers. Intra-African trade has historically hovered around 15 to 16% of total trade. Compare this with nearly 70% in Europe, 60% in Asia, and 50% in North America. Colonial borders, fragmented markets. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2018, aims to create a single continental market. The goal is to make borders invisible for trade purposes, fostering regional value chains instead of exporting raw materials. If successful, it would dismantle the colonial economic model. It represents the only viable path to overcoming the fragmentation inherited from the Scramble. But the challenges remain enormous. Infrastructure gaps are vast. Different colonial languages, English, French, Portuguese, create barriers. Customs systems were designed for extraction, not integration. Political will varies by country. And then there is the demographic urgency. Africa's population is currently 1.4 billion. It is projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. 60% are under 25 years old. This youth bulge represents either enormous opportunity or enormous risk. If colonial legacy issues are not addressed, we may see mass migration, radicalization, and conflict. But if resolved through integration, the economic growth potential is massive. Botswana offers a counter-narrative. A British protectorate, largely neglected because it was seen as a desert wasteland, it avoided the worst of settler colonialism. Upon independence, when massive diamond reserves were discovered, the leadership under Sir Seretse Khama managed resource rents for development. Today, Botswana is an upper-middle-income country with stable democracy. This shows that while colonial borders are a burden, the quality of governance matters. The survival of pre-colonial institutions, like the Gotla Consultative Councils, help.
As we have seen, most of Africa's borders make no sense because they were not designed for African people. In 1884, the Berlin Conference gathered 14 European nations to partition the continent, with not a single African representative invited. They established the principle of effective occupation, a rule that triggered a violent rush to claim territory. King Leopold the Second of Belgium turned the Congo, 76 times larger than Belgium, into personal property and extracted rubber through a forced labor system that killed approximately 10 million people. The British merged incompatible regions into Nigeria for economic convenience, leading to the Biafran War that cost up to 2 million lives. Belgian colonizers invented rigid ethnic categories in Rwanda, freezing fluid social identities into racial castes, directly causing the 1994 genocide. The infrastructure built within these borders, railways, ports, administrative systems, all designed for extraction, not development. Resources flowed from interior to coast to Europe, leaving African economies fragmented and dependent. When independence came in 1960, African leaders faced an impossible choice: redraw borders and risk endless wars, or keep colonial lines and manage internal conflicts. They chose uti possidetis juris, freezing the colonial map in international law. 140 years after the Berlin Conference, the ink lines drawn on maps in European offices still shape the lives of over 1 billion Africans. Post-colonial scholars argue that colonial borders remain the primary cause of Africa's struggles, and the evidence is compelling. Arbitrary borders DID, sever trade networks, force enemies together, create weak extractive states. Economic historians present a more nuanced view. While colonial legacy is real, post-independence governance, Cold War interference, and global economic structures are also major factors. Botswana's success shows that with good leadership, even colonial borders can be overcome. African voices themselves are diverse. Some demand reparations and full acknowledgement of colonial crimes. Others argue the continent must stop dwelling on the past and take ownership of the future. Young Africans increasingly reject the victimhood narrative while demanding justice. What is clear is that the decisions made in Berlin in 1884 were not about African development. They were about European profit and preventing European conflict. The borders created were for extraction, not nation building. As Africa faces a demographic boom, 2.5 billion people by 2050 with a massive youth population, resolution of colonial legacies is no longer just a matter of historical justice. It is a matter of global stability. The African Continental Free Trade Area represents hope that while the ink lines of 1884 may never be erased, their power to divide can be diminished. The challenge for the 21st century is to transform these lines of disconnect into seams of integration. History imposed these borders on Africa. The question now is, can Africa transcend them? If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for more balanced perspectives on global affairs. Let me know in the comments. Do you think African countries should attempt to redraw borders or continue working within colonial lines?